and welcome to today's very first podcast with Perfectus Livestock Solutions. If you like today's content, please feel free to share and like so we can continue to bring more of this to you in the future. With me today, I have Dr. Brian Dorcey with Perfectus Livestock Solutions. Dr. Dorcey, would you like to give a brief introduction of yourself?
My name is Brian Dorcey. Grew up in a cow-calf and swine operation in northeast Nebraska. Went to South Dakota State for undergraduate and then on to Iowa State for veterinary school. Moved to Worthington, Minnesota 20 years ago. Been in mixed animal practice over my career and have gravitated into the beef and feedlot consulting space in recent years. Generally practice from Montana to Michigan, kind of North Dakota to Kansas, and everything in between. Do farmer feeder work, do commercial feed yard work, as well as some calf ranch work. So all things beef, including some cow-calf consultation out west as well. So that's what gets up and gets me out of bed in the morning and drives me forward.
So with our topic today, knowing your numbers, what in your mind does that really mean, of knowing your numbers in today's cattle industry?
I think knowing your numbers means something different to every farm. And I think that's one of the things we do differently at Perfectus, is really getting to know the farm and the profit drivers of each farm. So I think in certain operations that I go to, the numbers that we need to know are morbidity, mortality, and cost of production. I think in other farms that we go to, we need to know feed costs and cost to gain. So I think our numbers are different in every farm that we go to, and I think that's what we do differently than a lot of our competitors, is we get to know the operation and the trigger points that are important for that farm and start at that point and work backwards. And so if I'm working with a high-risk feedlot operation, lots of times morbidity, mortality, antibiotic efficiency, and effectiveness are what we gravitate to on the veterinary space. As our nutritionists go out and gravitate to or ask questions on a farm, they gravitate toward cost of production, what's your corn cost, those kind of things. And so that's, I think, the difference that Perfectus brings to the table, is the fact that we can lean into each one of those and kind of bridge the gap. And as we start to talk about numbers with our farmers, lots of times overall farm profitability has a manure component, has a productivity of animals component, and a cropping component, especially as we work with our farmer feeders in our local area, as well as our feeder farmers. And those two populations I tend to find to have different goals and outcomes that are important to them, but I feel like we can lean into both of those.
So as we dive into the difference between a farmer feeder and a feeder farmer, what in your mind separates the two classes?
I think one of the biggest differentiators is when we talk to our feeder farmers, the cattle business on that operation is the primary profit driving entity. And so cattle performance and our cost to gain, I tend to find those operations have a sharper focus on cost of production. And so the cattle business leads some of the cropping business, and some of the manure benefits and some of the marketing of the corn comes in secondarily after the performance of the cattle. So that feeder farmer is really a cattle focused kind of a cattle focused kind of a producer. And I see that they know their numbers on the cattle side tighter than what a farmer feeder does. Now, a farmer feeder, in my opinion, some of those guys are feeding cattle to market their corn, and so they really are about feeding up their corn and maybe aren't as tight on their cost of gain numbers and knowing those as what our feeder farmers are. I find some of the farmer feeders tend to focus on manure value back to their cropping operations. So the joke is those guys are feeding cattle to make manure, and some are feeding cattle to market their corn and destroy feed, versus marketing or feeding cattle to make profit on the cattle business. And so the best farms that we work with today are making money on their corn, they're making money on their cattle, and they're using the manure as an additional profit income. So I find those farms rewarding to work with, because oftentimes they're a family-run operation. They can be large family operations, but lots of family around, generational succession plans. And being able to instill profit to make sure that that farm makes it to the next generation is one of the things that gets me out of bed in the morning to work with farmer feeders and feeder farmers.
So as we dive into the cost of gain portion of that, when we talk about feeding cattle, we know a lot of our customers are working with some kind of feed tracking system, whether it be Performance Livestock Analytics or Cattler. What do you feel is the most underutilized portion of those feed tracking systems?
I think assigning real-time costs inside those tracking systems is difficult for the folks that we work with. Let's face it, working on a farm is a very busy, daunting task, and there's lots of stuff to manage. And so one of the comments, you hear people say is we only use 10% of our brain capacity as humans, right? So I find that even though we have these aggressive and, cutting edge tracking systems that are out there, that we're only using about 10% of their capabilities. So we can use those not for just tracking inventory and feed delivery, but also the economic engine that's behind a lot of those often is underutilized because we don't have time to put in real-time costs of ingredients as they change through the process. And so through that, and if we don't assign costs, then we don't get to the cost to gain equation, or the answer to the cost to gain equation, very efficiently. And so one of the things we do really well at Perfectus is help our producers get a handle on their cost and get those costs in, because if we don't know our cost, we definitely cannot determine return on investment. And so one of the things that I see, whether it's our veterinarians, our nutritionists, our sales professional helping our farms with, is bringing a return on investment approach and given recommendations in that area. And without knowing the cost and the return on that, you can't determine a return.
Yep, that sounds very much what the cattle industry is kind of leading towards. So as we look at today's cattle market, obviously we know we're seeing some of the all-time highs within that. How important is it to truly know your return on investment as you look down through everything, whether it be veterinary costs, cost of gain, anything along those lines? Obviously you want to make sure that the yard is profitable to be able to continue through the future, but I feel like a lot of people are underutilizing that. What, in your opinion, is something that they can do better to be able to utilize everything that they have available to them?
Yeah, so I think it's interesting how many times a week I hear or have a conversation about there's no money in these cattle, and that is, in these high times, everybody's in short supply. Everybody is bidding the profit out of these cattle, bidding them to a break even. So the market's going to be the market. And as I talk to the producers that I consult with and give advice to, one of the things is about control what you can control. So what can you control? And what we can control today is our cost of production. And so what we give advice around is, what can we do, invest money in, how do we spend our dollars and allocate those to effectively reduce our cost of production? So that's, how do we utilize technology like Performance Livestock or Cattler or Animal Management Suite on those kind of tracking systems to make better decisions on either how we buy cattle, to make better recommendations and train our staff of how can we pull better and reduce our death loss, because in these high prices, death loss hurts. And so how can we use technology like metaphylaxis? How can we up our deworming strategy to produce a return on investment? How can we maximize our implant program to be compliant with label directions as well as maximize our productivity? And how can we improve our feed efficiency or reduce our cost to gain? And that's one of the things that's been fun for me in my seat as a veterinarian, to have an integrated approach, having a nutrition partner within Perfectus at the yard with me, is to have some visibility into the cost to gain conversation. And it's funny because as we start to balance on amino acids, we see our cost to gain go down, but not only does that pay us back in productivity of the animal, but it pays us back in health as well. As we get that rumen healthy, lots of times we see a reduction in our pulls and treats. And so it's a very integrated approach to a farm to reduce not only cost on the production side, but reduce costs on the death loss and health side as well. And it also helps train our cowboys, and so that we're not pulling for a digestive dead or a digestive pull. We're pulling for a pneumonia kind of a case definition. So as we get the nutrition right, some of the health stuff that comes along with it from the veterinary side is super valuable.
So as we look at the Profectus approach, obviously you mentioned balancing on amino acids, which is not something that a lot of people do. What do you think is the biggest mental block for people when they hear that approach, or even just getting out of the mentality of this is the way we've always done it kind of approach?
No, that's a great question, because it's something that I ask myself a lot as I'm on farms, because the Profectus approach shows cattle feeders a $50 to $75 advantage over what they've customarily been able to do, just balancing on net energy. And so if you rewind in the cattle industry, feeding cattle and cattle performance has always been based on energy. And Dr. Curley's approach, showing the benefit of balancing to amino acids, not just on energy, but amino acids to energy, has shown the ability to get better performance and maximize genetic potential. But one of the biggest hurdles that his approach has seen is this approach was tried back in the 70s and 80s. And what they did is going toward that amino acid approach with not as precise a tools as we have today. And so what they did was add cost by bringing in additional protein, additional amino acids. So they added cost, but they didn't add performance. And so everybody at that point threw their hands up and said, this is not something that's going to work. Yes, it works well in the pigs. Yes, it works well in the turkeys and chickens. We think that the rumen is probably blocking us from achieving the same approach in cattle. And through as Dr. Curley refined his approach over time, his equations have changed. And so we're not measuring, or Dr. Curley is not measuring on net energy for gain anymore. It's energy in relation to specific amino acids. And as we've done that, the performance has increased. So we do add some cost up front. And that's why getting to knowing the numbers of cost to gain is super important, because if you just add cost without performance, all you've done is add cost. But because we add cost and that performance comes with it, it actually reduces our overall cost to gain. So when I'm on a farm, I think about it like gallons of gas in your pickup. You can buy E85 for your pickup at $2.50 a gallon, and you get 15 miles per gallon. Or you can go buy premium for $3.50 a gallon, but you get 30 miles per gallon. So you've added $1 of cost, but you've doubled your mileage. And the same is true with our feed. And as you look at the cattle that we have today in our feed yards, my joke is we don't put 87 octane in Ferraris. And so on many of the yards that we go to, we're buying high-end cattle. We've invested in quality genetics, but we're still feeding them like the lowest price gas that we can buy. And so the feeders that are the most fun for me to work with are the ones that buy Ferraris and buy fuel for Ferraris. And we stand back and watch the performance. And so as our fixed costs on an operation tend to stay the same, whether we're feeding high risk or Ferrari type cattle, we can continue to get more pounds of beef out of the Ferrari cattle than we can out the door on the farm than we can out of the high risk cattle, with a lot less headache and a lot more systematic approach where we have some wash, rinse, repeat, which is easy on help, easy on equipment, and easy on just managing the day-to-day stress, especially in an integrated farming operation.
So as you look at the customer base that you currently work with, we've got customers that go all the way from day-old calves up to bringing in yearling cattle. Mm-hmm. Is the approach the same as you look through those different types of operations? Obviously, you're taking them through the different production cycles, but when you're looking at the overall performance of these animals, obviously you're wanting to start that as early as you can. Is there anything that you do different as you approach each of those type of operations?
I think, yeah, all of the above, they all have their own specific and unique challenges to manage, right? In that day-old calf operation, getting those through the calf ranch stage, maximum health, we've got a very immature immune system, so keeping them free of infectious disease and managing their nutrient requirements through that calf ranch stage, super important, because we don't want to crank them up and get a maximum performance at that point. It's about getting the baby healthy and ready to go to kindergarten. And so getting them through the calf ranch. And, then the next stage would be that, 220 to 500 or 220 to finish on some operations. We start to bring in, common sense driven times to step up performance. But as we've come together as Perfectus Livestock Solutions, that integrative approach of you can't look through only the lens of health or only the lens of nutrition when it comes to raising cattle. And so being able to have a trusted advisor in my peer nutritionist on a farm and say, hey, or they're challenging me and saying, hey, vet, I don't think your health is exactly right. And them not, going and tucking their tail and going in the corner and say, hey, nutritionist, I don't think your nutrition's quite right. It's working together to get that ironed out. And so I would say in that yearling to finish operation, it's about nutrition and maximum performance, right? Because those cattle they're healthy enough, they're old enough, most of that health stuff has been taken care of. In that kind of 4 weight, if we're talking about a beef calf, 450 to 650, it's getting them off, managing health as we commingle these groups, getting them off to a good start, and then we can start layering on performance. And so I think having performance in mind with health, and I don't think you can have one without the other. I think they're like the wheels of a bicycle. They've got to be balanced. You can't have one wheel, you can't have poor nutrition and maximum health, and you can't have maximum nutrition and poor health. You just have to have the wheels of the bike balanced. So looking through the lens on each individual operation is what is kind of our approach, and that's how we're different.
So as we start to talk performance, obviously we know that right now cattle are tending to be taken a little bit larger than what we've ever seen in terms of the finishing stage. How do we maximize performance as we look to take those cattle even larger than ever before? Yeah,
I think, with current sale weights creeping up to the way they are, I think we've got to focus even more on getting them started right. Because if we don't get that large animal off to a right start where we have some health challenges or we put too much starch to them too early, we really see our late-term death loss sneak up and the plateau on performance there at the end. So I think as we go out and talk with the growers that we work with, it's like, okay, what are our end weights? Because, as you add another 100 pounds, that changes our implant program, right? And one of the things that we really risk in decreasing performance is our implant running out at the end when those cattle are not very efficient. So I think starting with the end in mind and working backwards is where I tend to find my best ability to advise farmers today, is to make sure that I know what the goal is for that farm and what the market is rewarding so that they can maximize profit. And with that, start as early as possible in that production cycle, because then we have a better chance of hitting our target. So whether that's shoring up health early, whether that's, providing a better starter program, and whether that's knowing the source of the cattle. Did they come out of drought? Are we buying some put together stuff out of a sale barn? Are they backgrounded? Are they ballers? Those all make a big difference in the success of that animal at its last day at that farm. Starts at its first day.
What are some of the common mistakes you see when people are looking to track performance, especially on the feed side?
Yeah, I would say that, some of the common mistakes that I guess I see starts as we put our crop in the pile. Sometimes if we've got a lot of silage, it always amazes me the number of silage piles I see that don't have a tarp on. And as I go around the country, those silage piles can absolutely shrink 10% to 20%, super easy. And so when I drive onto a farm and I see an uncovered silage pile, those scream in my head a farm that doesn't know its numbers. Because if the banker knew that our corn crop or our feed stuff shrank by 20%, I'm sure they would lose their mind. And so that's step one is where I see that we don't understand what shrink is absolutely costing our yards. So I kind of start there on opportunities to improve our numbers or our cost of gain. Start at how we put up our feedstuffs, and then kind of going through the balance of the yard as I think about it. How we were procuring our feedstuffs is next, and how we're putting those up. Concrete generally pays for itself. Not that I'm judging that everybody needs to have concrete, but feedstuff preservation and shrink is an ongoing unknown cost that many of the producers that I work with deal with. And I would say the ones that are able to go to the sale barn and bid those calves past a break even or end up with calves in the yard are the ones that understand what shrink costs them and have actually put measures in place to manage shrink, whether that's pouring concrete, putting up a bunker, doing those kind of things. So when I get feeders that say, these calves, nobody can make any money, there are people that are making money on these calves. And it's not because they've got a better marketing agreement than so-and-so. Sometimes it's their ability to control costs. So I would say it starts with feedstuffs. Then I think it goes into feed formulation. I think people that understand what shrink costs them absolutely understand their cost of ingredients and are actually looking at performance. And those are the people that are attracted to the Perfectus Livestock Solutions feeding program are the ones that understand and track those costs because they understand the efficiency that they're able to pick up through our formulation program gives them the ability to bid those cattle past a break even and have their yard full of cattle because it does offer them such an economic advantage in feed conversion and feed efficiency. So those are the ongoing, it would be step 2 in my mind of, how we talk about cost. And I think step 3 is how do I employ technology that gives me a return on investment, whether that's implant technology, whether that's a deworming strategy technology, whether that's investing in my people on the yard to make sure that we're doing low stress cattle handling, that we're moving cattle without adding undue stress so that they respond to our vaccines better, they show us sickness earlier. The people factor in that is a component of technology. And then I would say the 4th step is measuring ability. So performing a closeout in cattle and assigning real-time costs so that we're not stealing from the crop operation to prop up our cattle operation, vice versa, so we can have an open, honest conversation about what our true cost of production is. So I think it starts at the day we put up feedstuffs to the day that we do a closeout, and there's opportunity in between to change the trajectory of a group of cattle at any given time.
And you touched on it briefly earlier, but what kind of results have producers who have started feeding the Perfectus livestock approach seen so far in their cattle as they've done everything from early entry weights all the way through closeouts?
Yeah, I would say, on average, we've done everything from, I've seen our nutritionists start 2-weight beef on dairy cross cattle to feeding, Western typical fall calf run Montana calves, and as well as starting at yearlings. And that cost to gain difference, of improvement has been anywhere from 4 cents to 12 cents, depending on the group of calves and the situation. So I think their ability and our ability as an integrated approach as a company to improve that cost of gain position is substantial, depending on the number of pounds that we're putting on. And depending on the feedstuffs and actually calling out true value of the feedstuffs, because I think every farm puts a different value on their feedstuffs, but coming to a benchmark kind of equation of true value of feedstuffs that would stand up to industry scrutiny from farm to farm has been super important. And the ability to see that cost difference as well as pick up some health benefits on that and reduce our morbidity and mortality, so not just performance but morbidity and mortality difference, has been super exciting for us to see. And it hits home the fastest with the farmer feeder, because typically they own the calves, they own the feedstuffs, and they're marketing their cattle. The custom feeder, if I'm owning cattle in a custom yard, that I've got some cattle that someone's custom feeding for me, I want them on the Profectus. It's the fastest way for a custom feeder to be more competitive in today's market, especially in a tight cattle supply, is to attract customers by reducing your cost of gain. Now, that efficiency gets passed on to the customer, and you've got a customer that comes back. And so the farmer feeder gets to realize every step of that, where the custom feeder doesn't get to realize as many facets of that cost of gain as what a farmer feeder does. So I think it applies to anyone in our business today, is where can I improve my cost of gain? And the Profectus solution system is through picking up feed efficiency.
So one of the nice things about our approach is that we can work with the customer in regards to whatever feedstuffs they may have on hand. Can you touch briefly on the wide variety of feedstuffs that we typically see when we're looking through our diets that we're trying to balance for?
Yeah, and that's kind of the part of the cool part, is the approach that the nutritionists take, that I've watched them take on farm, is let's start with your commodity that you're good at and back into our approach, because it's down to, we don't have a product to sell. I mean, we are not in the business, Profectus is not in the business of selling a product. They're in the business of bringing an approach. And it starts with what's your maximum, most profitable, easiest to grow feedstuffs, and then we'll back in and we'll bring in the amino acids that we need. But let's start what you're good at. From that, formulate down to the limiting amino acid, and then we'll bring that in some way, shape, or form. And so corn silage, all the upper Midwest feedstuffs are super easy for us to bring in, and it's been fun to watch some of this weird stuff that they've been, whether it's M&Ms or bakery waste or whatever. We can get there through that approach. We just bring you start with what you want to feed, and they bring in what we think the amino acids that you're deficient in. And so it's not been a one size fits all at any farm. And so whether it's corn silage or dry corn or distillers or whatever, what have you, we start with what you have access to. Some feed yards are planted right next to a distiller's plant. So how can we maximize that feed resource in your backyard? Some have thousands of acres of corn available to chop. Let's start with some corn silage in some big silos. So I think starting with the core components that are able to be farm grown help our farmers feed to a lower cost of gain, because what's your most efficient feed stuff to put up is where we want to start, and then bring our approach in on top of that. And that's where we add value to the feedstuffs that the farm's able to grow.
Is there any advice you have to maybe a younger producer who's looking to enter into the cattle feeding world right now?
Yeah, that's an interesting question, because I have that conversation a lot, because my age of guys, or the cattle feeders that I started with when I started my career here in Worthington, are now looking for options for their sons to come back into the operation. And it's interesting because, hey doc, what should we do? My son wants to come back, and I'm like, if you can put $50 to $100 a head in a war chest, because the cattle business is not always going to be this good. I look at our approach as our ability to help get that farm to the next generation. And so it's like, if you can pick up a $50 to $100 a head advantage per calf that you feed versus your neighbor who's doing it on the conventionally fed cattle, put that money in a war chest, so that when that next 80 comes up, or that next, quarter comes up for sale, or we want to put up a cattle barn, or we want to start owning more of our cattle, or put some out in custom, we've got that war chest that we can dip into. Because I think that Profectus advantage is one of the biggest things that I think we bring to a table on multi-generational farms, because dad could always do it his way, and it's got to the farm to this point. And like I say, we're looking at, dad looked at the numbers to the left of the decimal point, but in order for this farm to survive in the son's name and maybe the grandson's name, we're having to look at tenths of cents and hundreds of cents that we have to get there.
And you touched on it briefly earlier. Right now, we see a lot of the cattle in the market being the beef on dairy cross. What do you think the future of the cattle industry is? Is it more that beef on dairy, or do you see less and less of the native cattle as we talk about the contraction of the cow herds?
Yeah, I think, the beef on dairy are here to stay. And we've taken, as an industry, we've taken a lot of the variability out of that product, that animal, by at least stabilizing the sire side of that. And so, and I think there will be more of those to come. But our dairy herd isn't expanding either, right? And so at the rate that we need to satisfy our beef demand in today's day and age. Today, as it sits, there are 50,000 shackles a week that aren't getting used, that we would have space for in the beef industry. And the cow herd growth is slow, and it's a slow and methodical business. The average age of the rancher is getting higher. Capital requirements for young folks to get into a ranching situation or a cow-calf operation have never been higher than what they are today. And so the beef on dairy has earned itself a place in the beef business, and it's become a very predictable product. I think there will be a balanced growth between beef on dairy as well as replenishing the cow herd, and right now there's money in the cow-calf business. So we should have people starting to grow that. And as the cattle cycle continues on, the beef on dairy may be able to level out some of the peaks and valleys that we've historically seen. But we've got a great product in the beef business. Our demand continues to grow. And that's kudos to producing a good product, whether it be beef on dairy or a ranch, Western native calf. We continue to grow, and so I think the beef on dairy is here to stay. They fit really well into production systems. They're very predictable. They're born every day, so we can take some of the cyclicity out of the marketings for our feeders with a component of beef on dairy, where we're not in a seasonal marketing pattern like many of our cohorts are. And some of the most successful feeders that I work with have found ways to be counter-cyclical and provide animals when they're hard to find for the packer, and for that they're rewarded with a premium.
As we look at it from a packer perspective, what do you envision them seeing when it comes to cutout on not only beef on dairy, but just cattle industry in general? And are they going to, in turn, try to potentially at some point drive this market downward if we get into that situation, if the supply does get back to where it was?
I think there's always going to be a balance between supply and demand, and the market is going to be the market. So as supply comes back, one of the things that unintentional consequences, I would say, of COVID, or one of the positive outcomes for us as beef producers, was a lot of people went home and cooked their own steaks and got into and saw what really good beef tasted like and where it came from. And so I think we need to continue to build on that created demand. And as long as we can keep demand strong and supply comes to meet it, I think we'll be fine. In packer consolidation, it's interesting to see how many mid-level beef processing plants are coming online that have specific niche lines that they're gonna serve through there, as well as commodity beef. But I think I'm excited about some of the new packers that are going to be coming online, so that there is some variability and other options for our producers to deliver to. And I think the other piece that to that point is I'm starting to see the beef supply chain come together, where our finishers are lining up with backgrounders and trying to build on each other's strengths, so that we can continue the value of that animal through, so that not everybody makes the majority of the profit, but they share in the full value of that animal along the way. So packers are going to do what packers do, feeders are going to do what feeders do, and cows and calves are going to do what they do. And today the market's rewarding that cow-calf operation to produce more cows or more calves so that we can put them into the system. And so there will get a point that we do regrow. The market's going to be the market, and then hopefully we can keep the demand for our product outpacing the supply, so that we're always selling into a positive market.
What steps should a customer take to get to know their numbers truly? We've touched a little bit on a wide variety of things, but in your mind, what are the key points that they need to know to be able to truly track cost of gain, profitability, everything along those lines?
Yeah, I think one of the first steps of knowing your numbers is getting really good at knowing our feed conversion. I mean, that's what feed conversion pays the bills in a yard. And so knowing what our shrink on our feedstuffs is super important. I would start there, and then how we value, what does that crop cost us, or commodity cost us sitting in our bunker? Because from that cost point, then we can start to assign productivity points, and how we can manipulate our diet to increase production. Knowing what our true morbidity mortality is on the health and veterinary side is something that I feel like I've got operations that can do better at that. I've got operations that can do better at knowing what their cost is, because I find that we just put up the same amount of silage every year. We don't really assign a cost to it. And they don't look, some of my farms don't look at silage as a cost, but the banker does. Yeah, and everybody else does. So the silage is not free. So really being able to assign costs back to all your feedstuffs, being able to assign costs to the technology that you choose to embrace, whether that's a monthly subscription for Cattler or a monthly subscription for PLA, or using some of the growth promoting technologies like implants and feed additives, being able to measure your return on investment on that. And so doing a closing out cattle, I think, is super important with real-time costs. I'm always shocked at how many people are doing checkbook accounting, even in today's day and age. And we know that the market's at an all-time high. It's not going to stay high forever. Markets go up and go down. And if you said a month ago, will it go higher? I would have said no, but it went higher. So that just proves that my crystal ball is as cloudy as anybody else's. But we know we've got to be able to manage our equity on the way down when this thing starts to turn. And I think part of that is knowing your cost, as well as your ability to go bid on cattle. Because I am surprised at the number of yards right now that are partially full or not sitting at full capacity, because they don't feel they can go participate in that market, because their costs are higher than what cattle are bidding to today. And that's where I think the Profectus approach comes in and gives our customers a tool to have a lower cost position on their product, and gives them the ability to manage their costs better, so that when everybody else says cattle are too high, their yards are full. They're getting their yardage. They're keeping their people busy. I think the Profectus advantage is profound.
I think that's a great spot to end today. Thank you very much for your time today, Dr. Dorcey. And if there is anything that you would like to see for future comments, please let us know. But if you enjoyed today's content, please like and share so we can continue to bring this to you in the future.